I want to thank everybody again for joining the What's in Your Pond series, and Hal and Scott for their presentations, and Ray already this morning. I want to say it's not all doom and gloom out there. I hope nobody's getting that impression. What we're really trying to do is kind of at sometimes air the dirty laundry or, frustrations, because that's how we're going to improve. And we want to, we're hearing this from you, some of the information we're sharing, and we also want to hear back from you on how we can improve the overall, regulatory framework for dams and small ponds in the state of Maryland. And what I'm going to present today is a few hot topics and discuss what we're thinking about as they move forward. But then also some of our technical memoranda we've been putting out over the past year and a half or so, because what we're trying to do there is close the gaps, whether they're knowledge gaps or interpretation gaps of COMAR and 378. So let's see what we can do from there. So hot topics. I've got a few hot topics we want to talk about. And the first one has been on a lot of people's minds. It's the thermal reviews of ponds in Use 3 watersheds. Now, for quite a while, we had developed, I guess it was a written, policy that, in collaboration with DNR and others, that there was some degree of local discretion allowed for review and approval of small ponds in Use 3 watersheds. They had to meet certain conditions, but the local jurisdictions could approve those ponds in Use 3. About a year ago or so, the Attorney General's office at MDE caught wind of this, looked at the section of COMAR, and basically came to us and said, COMAR is clear and explicit. The approvals have to come from dam safety. There's no wriggle room for discretion. So that's too bad. It puts a burden on us. It puts a burden on local jurisdictions. It puts a burden on the developers. And particularly when this change happened, it caused some confusion. So just to recap where we are right now, all ponds in Use 3 watersheds must be submitted through the joint permit application process for a dam safety permit. The county would remain responsible for all other reviews that are necessary. So basically treat these small ponds as you would applying for a change to a higher significant hazard dam. The counties and the other local SCDs and things like that handle erosion sediment control and grading permits, but we tackle the 378 review. I will note that ponds that would otherwise be exempt from 378 review, like something less than 4 feet tall, will not require dam safety review or permitting in Use 3 watersheds. So that's the current state of things, but let's talk about where we're going to fix this. We do have a regulatory change underway to remove this requirement and kind of revert back to how we were 2 years, 3 years, 5 years ago. We think this will be a benefit for everybody involved. And if the regulatory change goes through, and we sure hope it does, then it would likely be effective in spring of 2021, less than 6 months from now. So we have to grin and bear it for the next few months. If there's an opportunity to delay a project, particularly since we're in the stream closure period now, you might be able to delay it long enough that we can go through the local soil conservation districts. But in accordance, and able to make this document and this change really effective, we do need to work with DNR, and hopefully they can lead the way on some kind of thermal best practices document so the design community has a clear understanding and consistent application across the state for what are the best things to look at when designing a new pond or modification of an existing pond as it pertains to thermal issues. And that consistency and clarity is something I'm going to touch on throughout this presentation. Another thing that we're thinking of, and Ray touched on it, as you can see here in the upper right side, the 2018 Ellicott City storm event. We can't deny that climate is changing. The storms are getting more intense. There's bigger temperature swings, longer droughts. Look at the Atlantic hurricane season this year. It's record setting. So it's forcing us to ask the question, do we need to change design storms? Should the annual exceedance probability, also called the recurrence interval and duration, change, maybe from a 100-year 24-hour storm to a 6-year 500-hour, 6-hour 500-year storm, or something like that? It's a question we're asking, but we don't have answers yet. It also forces us to ask the question, should NOAA Atlas 14 be updated with all of this new storm data, and what would that look like? And lastly, what kind of linkage between design storms for dam safety and the design storm for stormwater management exists, and how do they correlate, and is there a change in either of those needed? I will note that we have started a state-specific probable maximum precipitation study. We have a small seed grant that we'll have to build on to complete the study. Now, this PMP really is the design storm for high and significant hazard dams. So it doesn't apply to small ponds so much, but I think there's other aspects of that study that will. The study will include an evaluation of climate change factors in the state of Maryland. So, for example, if we follow the state of Colorado's example, they did this state study. They were able to determine that if you added a certain percentage of rainfall depth to the Atlas 14 data, that would account for expected climate change variables over the next 75 to 100 years. The study will also include an evaluation of the temporal distribution of rainfall. Are they front-loaded? Are they back-end loaded? Or they meet the traditional kind of steep peak in the center that we see nowadays? And that could change the hydrology and hydraulics for some of our ponds and dams. And if we have enough money, it may also include a probabilistic analysis of storms with a lesser recurrence interval, like the 10 and 100-year storms. So that could be fed into updates as well. A lot is questioning there, and there's a lot of work to be done, but it's something we're thinking about. Another thing we're thinking about and seeing is the fact that dams are aging and there's a lack of maintenance on some of them. I think this is particularly true in the farm pond arena, where they either still exist for agricultural purposes or they've become a nice water feature for a homeowners group. The average age of inventory dams in Maryland is over 50 years now, and likely a lot of these small ponds are of similar age. And we're often finding finding ponds with new owners who have no idea of the required maintenance obligations. And they think, well, if I purchased it in this condition, that's probably how it should have been, right? Take, for example, this farm pond in Harford County that's shown on the right-hand side of the picture. The upper picture is actually a person walking along the crest of the dam, and the pond is to the left. You'd barely even recognize that as a dam, but it is. In fact, it was 20 feet tall, and it turned out through hazard creep to be a significant hazard. So this leads us to the question, who is responsible for inspecting and enforcing proper maintenance of these farm ponds? And I have some ideas here. I'm not saying any one of them is right, but it's, again, something we need to be thinking about. So from one perspective, you could say, well, if the original approvals included maintenance requirements, then that original approval entity, like the SCD, ought to be responsible for ensuring that those maintenance requirements are met. Okay, that's one option. Another person might say, well, the local stormwater management agencies are doing triennial inspections on all the stormwater ponds in their states. Why don't they include these farm ponds in there in the interest of public and environmental safety and for the incidental stormwater benefits that they may provide? Okay, that's another perspective. And then, of course, it's easy to say, well, the state could inspect and enforce it too. We've got a dam safety division and a compliance and enforcement division. And that's another valid concern as well. I put this under the MDE side of it, but the low organizational priority or ambiguity of whether you have enforcement duties or opportunities in regulatory framework exists. So if we can't really get out and do long, lengthy enforcement because it's not as high a priority as maybe fixing high hazard dams or getting your triennial reviews done, what other tools do we have in our toolbox to bring owners into compliance? That's kind of what we're thinking at this point. Is education and outreach worth pursuing? I think yes. We can look into, are there opportunities for some kind of MS4 credits for repairing and restoring your ponds into good condition? Maybe. And are there grants and funding from non-government organizations, also maybe. I'd welcome suggestions from you all and what you can be doing to assist us to ensure that these ponds are operated and maintained in good condition. Now, I think we've brought it up a few times here in this What's in Your Pond series, but it is time to update 378. It's been 20 years, and both the MDE and the state NRCS office agree that the update is needed. I'll note that to update 378, a change in regulations in COMAR is required to reference the new standards. As Hal alluded to, we prefer to shift this from being a fully NRCS controlled document to one that we own in whole or in part. There's a couple reasons for that, but it helps facilitate changes out of cycle with the national NRCS 378 standard. And it also helps ensure that we can address issues that we're seeing or that our jurisdictions we work with are seeing and update them more effectively. It also makes sense because, for a simple fact, that the dam and small pond laws and regulations all flow through MDE, so it really ought to be a document that we control. That new 378 document is going to require hard work and careful thought for sure. We'd like to have work groups or workshops to ensure technical adequacy and consensus throughout the state and consistent application. I'll say that word again. But the first order of business, as we kick off, a roadmap for how we're going to do this update, is please submit your comments, suggestions, grievances, or examples of something better to me. I'll compile that and we'll go from there. I'll also note, I mentioned this in my presentation during the last workshop, but it went live today. Under the What's New section of our dam safety website, you'll see a link to the small pond expression of interest, I think is what we titled it. That's a Google form that you can fill out so that you can kind of be on the mailing list, so to speak, or the workshop lists if you'd like to participate in these updates. So check that out. Once the new 378 is completed, of course, we'll have to work on grandfathering for projects in the pipeline already and think about what kind of schedule is reasonable and prudent for periodic review and updates of the document. Lastly, we've all talked about, and we've heard from you, how tight staffing, resources, and expertise is throughout the state. It's a problem we're all dealing with. And again, I'm going to bring up the MOU and the other issues because we know that the agreements are out there, and it raises some concerns for MDE. Firstly, there's the question of what kind of gray area does this exist in the regulations and law. We know that the SCD integration and small pond process was accepted because of the resources and knowledge made available by the national NRCS offices. But if this review obligation is being shifted to a county workforce, we aren't really sure how that workforce is trained and are they current on the state of the practice both locally and nationally. I'll also say, how are we thinking beyond 378? We know there's gaps between the practice and the regulation. They exist out there right now. Think about what we call media ponds, ponds with filtration media on the bottom. Those aren't discussed in 378 at all, and how do we handle them? There's been some concerns from some folks about if we offer guidance documents or other things that are outside of the strict MD 378, some of the jurisdictions feel that they can't implement those because they're bound to 378 strictly. And I'll flip that around and say, well, but people are implementing things beyond 378 now, so how are we justifying some and not the others? It's important to get these MOUs to us, and I've got a list of the ones we know we have, so that we can review them all, ensure we have consistent application throughout the state and consistent compliance with the laws and regulations of the state. I'll also note that that regulatory change for use 3 ponds I mentioned previously has another very small tweak, and it discusses review and approval of these small ponds in accordance with 378 and the department's guidelines and policies. Now, with that in there, assuming that language remains through the implementation of the regulation, I think that will give the breathing room that folks need to adopt some of the guidance that we've put together. So let's talk about this guidance. I'm going to blow through about 12 guidance documents that are in progress or that are already put together, just so you're aware of them, because I don't think there's a full awareness of what we've been putting out on the website lately, and people need to be aware of it. Again, I'll remind everybody, I'm taking some stuff from my last presentation in September. Dam safety as a distinct program was formed in 1978, and our regulations have remained largely unchanged. We know that 378 doesn't meet current needs. It could be clearer. It doesn't address many current state of practices. So we've developed what we're calling policy memos, although that may not be the most appropriate term. We developed these policy memos to provide clarifications to design criteria based on the existing regulation framework. They apply to dams and small ponds alike, and we think there's a value to people. Once more, I'll just refer you to an article and regulations in COMAR, and I'll remind folks once again that 370 dams, Hal mentioned, and it's important to be aware of all of the regulations within the dam safety world, not just 378, as we're looking for consistent application throughout the state. All right, so on to these policy memorandum, and I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, but there should be a link in the chat box that will appear that guides you to where they are on the web page. I want you to be able to read through them at your leisure, but I just want to introduce them very briefly to you right now. The first policy memorandum deals with trees and woody vegetation on dams. That's already in COMAR, and there was a policy memorandum from 1993 titled Plantings on Roadway Dams. So what this policy memorandum does is it replaces and expands on that. It clarifies tree removal requirements. So when we say no woody vegetation, well, if the vegetation is already there, how should we treat it? What's the appropriate and acceptable way for removal? We've took some national guidance from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and other entities and developed some expectations. So we have consistent tree removal expectations throughout the state, which helps on everybody's end. Consistency makes things more efficient. It prevents those roadblocks that come up in frustrations. We've also provided a detail that you can give to a contractor for what's expected for removal of the roots of trees, if that's necessary. Policy memorandum number 2 deals with roadway and railroad embankments that have a culvert or potentially may act as a dam. Now, the existing 378 language for road embankments, or special embankments as they're called, is confusing. We know that because we see inconsistent application of that guidance, and it's really a language issue. It's unclear language. So what we've done with this policy memorandum is tried to resolve those confusing languages with some diagrams and some additional, hopefully what we think is more clear, plain English to allow you to understand when an embankment may excessively impound water and act potentially like a dam. Policy memorandum number 3, it's got limited application, but it resulted from some field inspections and concerns that were addressed as we were asked for some technical assistance on a small pond issue. It deals with the dangers of siting a dam or pond at the crest of a very steep slope. And in those cases, sometimes what you're doing is relying on that natural ground and the unknown geology of that ground to be the dam and impounding structure, incidentally or intentionally. And that could cause problems with slope stability and seepage issues. So there's some guidance here on what we think is appropriate setbacks and geometries to prevent some of these issues. Memorandum number 4 expands on the guidance that we've put out for dam breach analysis that Scott touched on. And it came about after a review of a number of small structures, and I mean bathtub type structures, where it just doesn't make sense to go through a long, lengthy dam breach process. So this provides for kind of a simplified hazard classification for really small storage volume and height structures where, we can all basically agree, yes, this is a Class A pond without any further. Talks about best practices for the construction of dams and small ponds. Now, we discussed this provided this presentation in 2019 at the seminar we provided at the Maritime Institute, and we're still working on this. We've got multiple stakeholders who are assisting us to determine what is the appropriate element here for how to supplement the Maryland 378 specifications. In my opinion, these specifications lack detail and are not comprehensive. It talks about, for instance, required soil compaction, but it doesn't talk about how frequently you should take the compaction testings and things like that. So this document is intended to aid designers, contractors, and inspectors. It's not a specification, but it's something that you can have there in your back pocket, and learn from, so we can develop better plans, we can review better, and we can inspect the construction better to ensure that we have well-constructed ponds and dams in the state. Scott talked about the need for a permit anytime you change a dam. And policy memorandum number 6 about dam decommissioning addresses that issue. Now, dam removal ought to require an approval as well, because it is a change to the structure. And for a long time, dam safety has had, an unwritten understanding of what's expected, what's the proper design for a breach channel through an earthen embankment. This formalizes that and writes it down finally. So we all know what it is, it's clear, and you can have that before your project kicks off. This document also provides general concepts to consider when planning a dam removal, like outreach to other resource stakeholders like DNR, and they might have concerns or support of the project, and what to do about the sediment stored behind the dam. So that's a good document if you have a potential removal project to look at. Number 7, we're halfway through now, talks about impoundment filling dams. And Hal talked about how a lot of the dams he showed failed on or shortly after first filling. Now, I think this really relates mostly to dams and not small ponds, and that's okay. I still want to mention it to you all. Our permits for dams require an impoundment filling plan be provided to the department before you start filling the dam embankment with water. Again, this is the first time that they've felt these kind of stresses and pressures. So we want to make sure that we have all expectations on filling rate, monitoring, things to watch out for. So this provides clarification on what we're looking for. As previously, people would just ask us, well, you have this permit condition, but what do you need? Now we're putting it out there. Policy memorandum number 8 touches further on some of the stuff that Hal talked about, structural considerations for design of risers and trash racks. This is under development with multi-stakeholder input received, and really both COMAR and 378 discuss structural design in some ways, but they don't take it all the way to make it an implementable recommendation. And that's what this document is intended to do. It's closing that gap so we all know with consistency what's expected of us from the design side and the review side.
John, we have 6 minutes to go, and there are a few questions there.
Thank you. I'll try to go quicker. Water storage and collection tanks. This addresses the broad definition of dam and regulations, where a tank could be considered a dam. So in some cases, you may need to submit your design to dam safety to see if there's a hazard that needs to be addressed or if this needs to be regulated as a dam or not, because in some cases, it doesn't make sense. Policy memorandum number 10 discusses utility embankments. Again, it just expands on what 378 and COMAR already says, as Hal talked about it, provides consistency and clarity because we think that wasn't always being read and understood in 378. Policy memorandum number 11 is one that I hope people will be very happy to see. It talks about normal maintenance activities that shouldn't require approvals or permits. Normal maintenance, dredging of your sediment forebay, that's expected, right? That shows good ownership practices. So, we made a list here of activities that we think can be considered normal maintenance and not require permits or authorization. Lastly, policy memo number 12, excavated ponds, is providing clarity and there's some contradictory language in 378 about small ponds, excavated ponds. It's under development with multiple people weighing in and assisting us on this, and it's hopefully will be out soon. So that's some of what we're doing. We've also got a whole bunch of other future work planned, and I'll just touch on a few of these very quickly. We think there's a need for some consistent weir wall design guidance throughout the state. Maryland 378 refers to an actual rescinded section of the NRCS National Engineering Handbook that's been rescinded since 1968. So if you have some weir wall design guidance and would like to share it with us, that'd be great. We also think we need to expand on geotechnical investigations and design guidance recommendations. And we started work a long time ago. We need to pick it back up on a filter diaphragm design aid for everybody. There's a few other things here I'm going to skip so we can get to some questions. But, you know, I do want to reinforce again, this is what we're seeing and what we think is important for us and for you. But there's probably things that we're not seeing and that we don't recognize as a need. So please, please, please let us know what else you need to improve consistency across your jurisdictions, across the state, so that everybody knows what's expected of them, and then we can go from there. All right. Hopefully we have a few more minutes left for questions, and if not,